Hello everybody, what we're going to have a go at doing today is painting a tulip in watercolour. So I suggest that you either find a tulip from your garden if possible, or that you find a photographic reference online or in a book. So what I'm going to go through first are the colours that I'm going to use for my watercolour. And the first one, test your colours out on a piece of watercolour paper, back of an old sheet, to see that you've got everything mixed in advance. So this is permanent rose with quite a lot of water in it. The next one is permanent rose, much stronger. I'm going to be using both of those. Then I'm going to move on to permanent rose. Now this has got a little bit of Windsor blue, but you could also use something like Prussian blue or Antwerp blue, and obviously a bit of water. The next one is alizarin crimson, but this also has got a tiny bit of vermilion, which is like a strong orange, deep orange, and a tiny bit of Antwerp blue. The blues are entirely up to you. I've tried to stick with transparent colours. And then the next one I'm going to be using is a combination of permanent rose and aureolin, which is a bright yellow. And finally, I have got a strong alizarin crimson. So that's the palette of colours that I've chosen to use for my tulip, which is a pink tulip. I've done a basic outline of my tulip with the stem and a couple of petals, but make a nice arrangement on your page. It's completely up to you whether you want to have it set against white paper, which is what I'm going to do, or if you want to put a background in. If you're going to do a background, it might be an idea to do that at this stage, but I'm just going to set mine against white paper. So the first washes I'm going to put down, start at the top of your tulip and work a petal at a time, and let each petal dry so that you get a sharp edge to each petal. But we're going to work wet in wet within that petal. So I'm beginning with my lightest wash first, which is my very diluted permanent rose. And I'm going to run that over that entire petal so that I can then drop other colours in where I want to. So that first petal, this is the lightest colour. Now if you have any areas where it should be very, very pale, you can then clean your brush and use a damp brush just to lift out little bits of light. So if you've got anywhere where you want it to be really pale, clean the colour off the brush at this stage. And then I'm going to pick up my next strongest colour and drop that in. Now I'm not using a particularly small brush for this, I'm using something along the lines of a size 7 and touching the colour in. If you find things are drying too quickly, where you're working is quite warm, just let it dry completely. You can always re-wet with clean water. So I'm dropping the colour in and cleaning the brush off, wiping the moisture off on some kitchen paper in between, and then picking up the next strongest colour. I've pre-mixed all my colours so that I can just work from one colour to the next. Bear in mind, everything is going to start to dry, well, it will dry probably 30 to 40% lighter. So you have to bear that in mind. And I can move things around. If I put too much water on, I'll get cauliflowers, which wouldn't matter at this stage because I am going to be building layers up. So I'm going to pick up my next, actually I'll use a little bit of mauve I think at this stage, and put a tiny bit of mauve in. And take the moisture off my brush and move that around. Again, taking my damp brush and just lifting the colour where I don't want it to go. tiny bit of moisture on the brush, just to move it in a little bit. That petal has almost dried, so that's about as far as I can go on there at that stage. Now that that first watercolour has dried, I'm just going to go in. I've moved down to a much smaller brush, something like a size 3, and I'm coming in to do a little bit of detail where I need a hard edge. So I've moved to a smaller brush to do a finer bit of detail, and again, while that bit of colour is still wet, I am going to drop other colours into it, so we're not just leaving one flat colour for that little bit of shadow there off of a very small brush. Okay, and then I can come down into this section which has got a bit of shadow underneath it. This is a much stronger bit of alizarin crimson, so I can put that in, and again use just water on my brush to pull the colour down. At the same time, I'm going to pick up a little bit of my orangey colour and work some of that in and move it round with some water. All the time taking the excess moisture off on a piece of kitchen paper, and I just need to touch a little bit of pink into the bottom edge of that and let it bleed. So we're doing wet in wet, but on a very small scale. And some of the slightly darker mix, I can touch that in under there as well. And we'll see how that dries. We may have to go a little bit stronger later, but we'll see how that bit dries. I can't do this bottom edge because that section's still wet, so be patient, move on to something else and come back to that later. Now that I've finished getting the washes on the top section of the tulip, I thought it might be useful if I demonstrated the main petal. So I'm still using my 3 brushes, the size 10, then I'm moving down to this one, which is about a 7, something like that, and then a 2. So I'm going to use those 3 to concentrate on. So again, starting with the lightest wash, and I'm going to get that over the entire petal. Everything else around it is now dry, so I'm not going to get colours bleeding across. So using, in fact I'll use the biggest brush, I'll use the 10 to get the colour down quickly. And I can put that over the entire petal. I've left a little bit of space on the edge here where there's some white or very pale colour. So I'm just going to load that across. That can then be drying a little bit. Take that across. Use the brush to just mop any excess colour. But it doesn't matter if it puddles a little bit. And use the point of the brush to come right to the edges. Okay, now I can move down to a slightly smaller brush and just soften that edge with a damp brush so that you haven't got a harsh line to the white. The brush is only damp, it's not wet, but it just gives a little bit of a softness rather than a really heavy line. And then I can mop up the excess colour from the bottom. Right, okay, so now I'm going to start going in with my stronger pinks. So while that's still wet, I can bring in, this is the stronger mix of permanent rose, and I can let that just run across the petal. Bear in mind, the thicker the mix of colour, the slower it will move. So if your colours are very watery, they're going to travel a long way. If they're a bit thicker, they won't move so far. So I can start to drop that in, and then I'm going to go on this side a little bit darker. So I'm going to use some of my stronger alizarin crimson and drop a bit of that in as well on this side. Again, the more of the subtly different colours that you put in, the more interesting you'll find your end result is. I'm going to move down to a smaller brush and I'm going to introduce, because this is very wet over this side, I'm going to bring in some of the mauve. So use the small brush, and the mauve is a much wetter mix, so I'll let that touch in on the side here. And just a little bit around the edge. Just there. Okay. Now I need to go a little bit darker at the top, so this is my stronger mix of the alizarin, vermilion and a little bit of blue, and I'm going to touch that in at the top and let that bleed down. We'll see how that dries. Now that the colour has settled a little bit, it's still pretty wet, but I'm using my brush and I'm just mopping the excess colour and wiping it on some kitchen paper, because I want to pick out a little areas of highlight. So although the colour will flood back in again, I can put in some soft highlights with this, and where the colour has just crept across a bit further than I want it to on some parts, just use the tip of a brush that's got a good point and use it as a tool to mop the colour up. While you can still see a shine on the colour, you can continue to drop darker bits in. So I'm going to mix a slightly deeper purpley colour, slightly darker consistency, using alizarin crimson and a little bit of my probably Windsor blue or something along those lines, even Prussian blue you could use, and I'm just going to touch a little bit of that in. It looks pretty dark now, but hopefully will dry that bit lighter, so I'm going to be bold, and that should take the underside of the tulip away. So just tease it around with the brush a little bit, but it's still wet so it can still travel and it won't make harsh lines, it'll be quite soft. But it's not a watery consistency, so I shouldn't get those sort of cauliflower effects appearing. And again, if it runs too far, just use your clean brush to mop it back to where you don't want the colour to run to. A little bit of lightness on the bottom. Okay, I'm going to leave that to dry. Right, so now I've finished the actual flower head itself, or finished it for the moment. What I have done is put a light mauve wash across this large petal onto the petal when it's dry, so that it forms a hard edge. Just light purple wash over the top for that bit of shadow on it. I will come back later on and just finish off some of the other petals that need to have a little bit more dark or light added to them, but I'm now going to move on to the stem and the leaves. So the colours that I have got mixed for this are yellow, which is for me a gamboge, but you could use something like cadmium yellow, and then I have put the gamboge with a little bit of a fairly strong blue, like a Windsor blue or an Antwerp, could be a Prussian, something like that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be a blue that you have yourself. And then I've got another green mixed, which is the same combination of gamboge and the yellow I was using, which I think was, I said was not Aureolin, it was, I've forgotten which yellow it was, gamboge. So I've put the two together, this time with much more of a blue, stronger blue. And then lastly, for the greens, I've done the same yellow, but this time with a little bit of cerulean blue, and I've put a tiny, a lot more water in it, so it's much paler. You could use the Windsor blue again, but this time I've put a lot more water with it to make it a much sort of duller blue. And then I've also got a little bit of mauve that I used from the Tulip ready to drop in. Right, moving on to the stem and the leaves. So what I'm going to do is start off with, again, the lightest colour first. So I'm going to use a little bit of this pale yellowy green and put that down to begin with, and then I can drop other colours into that. So make sure you're using a brush that's got a decent point to it so that you can get into the edges. I'm also going to pick up some water as I go and dilute some of it down just with clean water so that I don't get one flat wash that's got a little bit of gradation in it. And use kitchen paper to mop up your excess colour as you go. The bottom of this is just going to fade out on the picture. While that's still wet, I'm going to drop in another hint of colour. And let that bleed across. And move on to a similar thing with the stem. Pick up water and fade the colour around the stem with clean water. And more of a muted green, drop some of that in. And while that's still wet, I'm going to pick up some purple and introduce that. Even at this early stage, I can bring some stronger green in towards the bottom. Now on this side, I'm going to pick up some of my pure yellow and touch some pure yellow into this petal because the sunlight is coming through it. So hopefully that will dry with a hint of that golden colour coming through. So this is all wet in wet. And I'm actually, as you can see, loading the brush with a fair bit of colour and introducing other colours into it. Later on I'll be able to go back and put darker washes on top. Again, just fade it out at the bottom. Right, so now we're on to finishing touches on the actual flower itself. So So if there's any areas where you think that the colour has faded down, whatever colour your flower is, you can, now's the time to go back and sort of reinvigorate. So I'm just going to strengthen my pink up here, so back to my permanent rose, a little touch of it, and then just use clean water to soften that edge, just to bring the colour out a little bit more. Where else do we need to do bits and pieces like that? So I've got some slightly stronger pinks I think to put back into this section here. So again, using water just to soften the edges. What I am going to do is use a really tiny brush. So this is a 0, and I'm going to put some little fine lines in that just follow the curve of the petal, just on the light sections, so that it helps to give the curve on the edges of the petal. Now I don't want to do this that's almost too dark. I just want to dilute the colour slightly and just have a few faint lines. So that's my permanent rose with a bit of water in it, just to give a little bit of curve to the edges of the petal. I won't do this all over the painting, I'll just pick and choose a few spots. I'm going to use some water just to fade the bottom of that in to make the petals stand out a bit more. And I think I'll do a similar thing up here on this one to bring this forward a bit. So I'm going to darken the edge there, and again use some water to just soften that in. And pull the colour round to bring some lines through. Vary the colour a bit more, drop some more pink into that. A little bit more shape and a little touch of texture. Into the petal. Don't panic because you think it's gone in too dark. It's going to dry 40% lighter. So don't immediately think, oh my goodness, and blot it off, because you'll end up just having to do it all over again. And always use water to move things around. So I'll just do a few of these finishing touches and the painting will be done.